Imagine waking up knowing that in 24 hours, you will be dead. No more tricks, no more delays, no last confessions, just a countdown to the lethal injection. This is what the last days of the world's worst serial killers looked like. Men who spread fear for decades, now alone in their cells, numbed by guilt, routine, and panic. In this video, you'll see what happens in the last 24 hours before a serial killer dies. It was the morning of January 17th, 1977, when Gary Gilmore woke up in his cell at Utah State Prison, knowing he had only a few hours left to live. While other death row inmates tried for years to delay their execution, Gilmore had done the opposite. He insisted that the sentence be carried out. No mercy, no appeals, no reprieve. Gilmore was a murderer, convicted of shooting 2 men in cold blood. But more than his actions, it was the fact that he was the first person to be executed after the reinstatement of the death penalty in the U.S., which made him notorious. He thus unwittingly became a symbol of a new era of state executions. His last 24 hours were frighteningly sober. He ate a steak, potatoes, coffee, and a whiskey, a meal he ate calmly as if it were an ordinary day. No trembling, no panic, just the stoic calm of a man who had demanded his own death. While other prisoners make confessions or write letters in their final hours, Gilmore remained laconic. He wrote a few short notes to his family, including the sentence, "I'm tired of it." He said no more. Shortly before sunrise, he was led into a sparse room with sandbags on the wall. He was offered a black hood, but he refused. He wanted to see, to consciously retain his last view. Soldiers from the firing squad stood ready, rifles at the ready. A reporter who witnessed the scene later described it as surreal. No drama, no shouting, just this eerie calm. When the prison warden asked if Gilmore had any last words, he simply replied, "Let's do it." 3 words that later even became the inspiration for a world-famous advertising slogan. Then a command. Shots rang out, Gilmore slumped in his chair. No mercy, no hesitation, just the end. For America, it was a signal. After a decade without executions, the death penalty was back, and Gilmore had voluntarily kicked things off. To many, he was a monster. To others, a martyr for the right to die. But in the end, he was just a man who decided that his last day should come sooner than anyone had expected. On the morning of October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos, America's most notorious female serial killer, woke up in her cell at the Broward Correctional Institution in Florida. After more than a decade on death row, this was the last day of her life. But unlike many who spend their final hours in silence or remorse, Aileen remained what she had been her entire life: contradictory, loud, angry. Wuornos was no ordinary serial killer. She was a woman who picked up men on the highway only to shoot them with a gun. To some, she was a monster. To others, a victim. A woman pushed into utter darkness by abuse, violence, and poverty. But however you saw her, on that last day, she left no one indifferent. Her final 24 hours were an interplay of bizarre calm and feverish paranoia. She refused a lavish last meal. Instead, she only wanted a simple black coffee, as sober as her mood. Reporters who had seen her in the days before described her as increasingly erratic. She spoke of secret experiments, of sonic pressure being used to manipulate her in prison. Words that sounded like paranoia, but were delivered with a vehemence that revealed her inner turmoil. On that day, she received a visit from British documentary filmmaker Mick Broomfield. The camera rolled as Aileen made her final appearance. She accused the police of deliberately letting her be killed so that they could present a serial killer. Her words were confused, her eyes wild, but you could sense that she deeply believed what she was saying. When the sun rose in the morning, she refused sedation. "I want to be awake," she said. And so, a few hours later, she was led into the sterile chamber. Witnesses described her as almost cheerful, smiling as she returned the glances of those present. When asked for her last words, she spoke a message that was as cryptic as it was disturbing. "I'll be back with Jesus on Independence Day, with a mothership and all that. I'll be back." Minutes later, the lethal substances flowed through her veins. At 9:47 a.m., Aileen Wuornos was dead. She died as she had lived, uncomfortable, unpredictable, and until the end, a woman who refused to be silent. On the night of July 12, 1931, Peter Curtin, better known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, sat in his cell in Klingelplatz prison in Cologne. Only a few hours separated him from the guillotine. For a normal person, this would be the stuff of nightmares, but for Curtin, it was almost a feeling of anticipation. Curtin had been convicted of a series of murders, robberies, and brutal attacks that had terrorized Germany in the 1920s. His actions were driven by a perverse fascination with blood. He drank it, fantasized about it, and described his lust for killing with disturbing candor. So it's hardly surprising that his final hours were also marked by this obsession. On the evening of his execution, he was allowed to request a last meal: Wiener Schnitzel, fried potatoes, and a bottle of white wine. Curtin ate with relish, as if he were in a restaurant and not on his way to the guillotine. Afterwards, he smoked a cigarette, completely calm, almost relaxed. But the truly disturbing part came in his conversation with the prison chaplain. There, Curtin asked a question that witnesses would still quote decades later. "Will I hear my own blood rushing after I am beheaded? That would be the greatest pleasure I can imagine." No sign of remorse, no thought for his victims, just a morbid curiosity as to whether even his death would hold a perverse experience in store for him. On the morning of July 2, shortly after 6 o'clock, Curtin was led into the prison courtyard. The guillotine stood ready. The scaffold was cold and silent. An executioner in a black coat was already waiting. Witnesses described Curtin as composed, almost proud, like someone facing a macabre finale. Without resistance, he placed his head under the blade. The sled rushed forward, the blade fell, a single blow, and the Vampire of Dusseldorf was dead. Later, doctors examined his brain in the hope of finding a biological explanation for his perversions, but they found nothing. No tumor, no malformation. Nothing except the fact that some monsters are simply born of their own free will. Peter Curtin died as he had lived, without remorse, without guilt, driven by a thirst for blood until the very last second. If these last hours fascinate you, then click like and subscribe now, because the next 3 serial killers show just how deep the abyss really goes. On January 23, 1989, one day before his execution, Ted Bundy did not seem like the charismatic serial killer that the media had known for years. Behind the walls of Florida State Prison, a man slowly realized that his last act was coming to an end. Bundy had killed dozens of women. No one knows exactly how many. In court, he played the charming student, the educated lawyer, even his own attorney. He enjoyed the attention, the headlines, the morbid fascination he arose. But in his last 24 hours, even this facade fell away, piece by piece. He refused a special last meal and was given the standard portion instead: steak, eggs, toast, and potatoes. But he hardly ate any of it. Witnesses reported that he was restless, wavering between composure and despair. At times he spoke calmly with his lawyers. At other times, he burst into tears. On this last night, he allowed himself to be accompanied by a clergyman. Reverend Fred Lawrence sat with him for hours, talking about guilt, forgiveness, and faith. But even then, Bundy seemed more like an actor trying out a new role than a man fighting for his soul. He called his mother twice, not to apologize for his victims, but to hear her love one last time. "I love you," she said. He replied, almost like a child afraid of the dark. On the morning of January 24, shortly after 7 o'clock, Bundy was led into the room with the electric chair, Old Sparky. Witnesses described him as pale but composed. He nodded to his lawyers and the Reverend before uttering his last words: "Give my love to my family and friends." Then they put the black hood on him. Seconds later, electricity rushed through his body. Outside the prison, people celebrated. They sang, set off fireworks, and held signs reading, "Burn, Bundy, burn." For them, it wasn't an execution. It was catharsis, a party, a triumph over the monster who had terrorized them for years. Ted Bundy, who had wanted to remain in control of his entire life, died in the chair, this time without control, without a show, and without applause. On May 9, 1994, John Wayne Gacy, one of the most cruel serial killers in U.S. history, woke up in his cell at Stateville Correctional Center. Only a few hours separated him from lethal injection. For the families of his 33 victims, this was the day they had been waiting for over a decade. But Gacy himself showed no remorse. He seemed almost defiant, as if he wanted to use his last day to maintain control. Instead of talking about his victims, he was preoccupied with another issue, a legal dispute over the sale of his bizarre prison art. His Pogo the Clown paintings should not belong to the state, but should bring money to his family. Even in his final hours, it was power and money, not guilt or remorse, that filled his thoughts. In the afternoon, he was allowed to receive visits from relatives and close friends. Some were surprised at how calm and even friendly he seemed. He deliberately steered conversations away from the execution, talking about baseball and the Chicago Cubs, as if there were no death sentence hanging over him. His last meal also reflected this contradiction: a bucket of KFC, 12 shrimp, fries, strawberries, and a Diet Coke. Almost like a macabre feast, a throwback to his past as a restaurant manager. Hundreds had gathered outside the prison. Some held up banners, others brought 33 black bags, one for each victim. It was not a silent vigil, but a bizarre mix of grief, anger, and celebration. Goodbye, Daisy, some sang, as if it were a grotesque street party. At midnight, Daisy was taken to the execution chamber. He lay on the stretcher, shackled, still showing no visible remorse. His alleged last words, "kiss my ass," remains controversial to this day. Some witnesses swear he said them, others claim he died silently. The injection did not go smoothly. A problem with the line delayed the process, so that instead of the usual few minutes, it took a full 18. Finally, his heart stopped at 12:58 a.m. For many of the victims' families, it was the moment they had been waiting for. For others, the question remained: could such a death ever compensate for all the suffering he had caused? John Wayne Gacy went as he had lived, without remorse, without apology, as the clown in a grotesque final show. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer's last day began, without him knowing it. The man whose name had become synonymous with cannibalism, necrophilia, and unimaginable cruelty had been an inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin for 3 years. Sentenced to 16 life sentences, his fate seemed sealed. But the real end was not waiting on death row, but in the prison corridor. In the years before, Dahmer had tried to portray himself as reformed. In interviews, he spoke of religion, guilt, and a newfound faith. Some believed him, others thought it was just another game played by a man who had spent his whole life wearing masks and deceiving others. What is certain is that many fellow inmates despised him, not only for his crimes, but also because he made macabre jokes about them, such as how he used food to form body parts or provoked other prisoners. On November 28th, Dahmer was supposed to take on a cleaning shift together with 2 other prisoners, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. Without direct supervision, a routine task. But it didn't take long for routine to turn into a death sentence. Scarver, himself convicted of murder, attacked Dahmer with a hidden metal rod. He struck him repeatedly on the head, so violently that witnesses later said Dahmer was barely able to react. Minutes later, the Milwaukee cannibal lay covered in blood on the floor of the prison toilet. He fought briefly for his life, but was pronounced dead at 9:11 a.m. at the hospital. Ironically, his death was almost a mirror image of his first murder. His first victim, Stephen Hicks, had also been killed from behind with a metal rod. The circle was complete, cruel and symbolic at the same time. For the families of his victims, Dahmer's end was a mixture of relief and bitterness. Some felt justice had been done, others regretted that he had escaped official execution. And yet his death seemed like an inevitable consequence. A man who, even in prison, did not stop spreading fear and revulsion. Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal who was called a monster, did not die at the hands of the state, but at the hands of another murderer, without last words, without a grand stage, just a quiet, brutal death in a prison toilet. The final 24 hours of these serial killers show that even the most cruel perpetrators eventually lose everything: power, control, and ultimately even their voice. Some died defiantly, others broken, but all the same, powerless and at the mercy of death. All that remains for the world are the stories that continue to shock and fascinate to this day. If you want to delve deeper into the darkest chapters of criminal history, click on our playlist now. There are even more abysses waiting there that you will never forget.